Daniel here from JCAB Pictures, and this is a brief timeline of thriller films from the 1950s up till the modern day. Firstly, let's start with a definition of what a thriller film is. So, a thriller film is a genre that revolves around anticipation and suspense. The aim for a thriller is to keep the audience on the alert and on the edge of their seats. Often, the protagonists in these films are set with a challenge or a problem, like, for example, an escape from the film The Great Escape, a mystery from some of the films we're going to look at now, or a crime, which is also some of the films I'm going to look at now. So the first film on our timeline comes from 1954, and it's Alfred Hitchcock's The Rear Window. The plot for this film is very simple. L.B. Jeffries is a war photographer, and he's taking photos at a racetrack, and he breaks his leg, so he's confined to just his apartment for weeks, about 7-8 weeks. And he gets around to snooping, looking out the window, looking at everyone else in his apartment complex. You know, sort of making stories for them and all this. And then the Forwalls, people across, he's convinced that Mr. Forward has murdered his wife. And then he's trying to convince everyone that he has. And that's the plot of the film. So straight away from this plot synopsis, you can tell that this is a thriller because it involves a mystery and a possible crime of murder, which is very common. So let's just get into some more conventions of conventions possibly. This film is set quite ingeniously done in just his apartment is where it's mostly set, and it's a lot of long shots when people go over when he's looking at the other apartments, keeping the idea of like he's trapped and confined, which adds to the suspense and anticipation for the audience, which also aids the fact it's a thriller film. The characters in this film, well, the protagonists are L.B. Jeffs, a male middle-aged war photographer, Lisa Vermont, who is a very wealthy and intelligent high-class woman, which I feel like, even though it was the 50s and women still had rights, I feel like it still wasn't as common back then for women to be this powerful, which is something else. Then a detective, Doyle, who, well, as I said before, crime. Usually, I believe, in most thriller films, there's going to be some sort of policeman or detective or something. So this just lives up to that convention. And then the antagonist is Mr. Forward, who's just a regular man. Normal, does his day-to-day routine. He's a jewellery salesman in this, but usually they're just a working man in thriller films. But he has committed a crime, in this case, a murder, which is very common and is usually the problem in these thriller films. The music used in this film is used not often when there's a lot of dialogue, but in bits which need to create such suspense and anticipation. For example, the scene where Lisa tries to go into Mr. Forwall's apartment to look for evidence of his murdered wife. There's a lot of non-diegetic sound which creates suspense and leaves the audience on the edge of their seat, which goes back to the definition I said for thriller earlier. So that is our first film from 1954. And now we will go on swiftly to our next film from the 60s. The second film in our timeline is from 1962, The Mercurian Candidate, which was directed by John Frankenheimer. And this film falls into a subcategory of thriller films called political thrillers, which, from the title, you can guess what they are pretty much. So you can kind of guess what this film is going to be. So the plot synopsis for this one is a US Army hero returns to New York from Korea, but has been mysteriously programmed by communists to assassinate a presidential nominee. But when his army buddy becomes suspicious of his going-ons, he's on the trail to stop him. Now, the general setting of this film is a lot of army bases, sort of military, sort of hidden bases and stuff, which you could say is quite like similar to a police station or something. So there's a lot of soldiers, obviously, in this film, which falls into the conventions of police officers, detectives, as I said previously. So, sort of continuing the conventions of the 50s into this one with the general characters and setting. With the setting also being a lot of apartments, which is, again, the first film we saw from the 50s was just in an apartment. So they've carried on here. So the characters in this, well, the protagonist is Major Marco. So a major means he has authority, and an army man, bit like a detective, because his work in this film, he goes into detecting, trying to find out what's his brainwash mate, Raymond Shaw, who's he's a mix on protagonist and antagonist film, which playing on both sides of the role, quite ingenious in my opinion, but quite difficult to define him to one, because in the end, even though he does something, commit a crime, he does it for the greater good, you could say. And then, this is interesting, the main antagonist is Eleanor Shaw, Raymond Shaw's mother, but a woman being the main antagonist in a thriller film. This was quite new. This was 60s was one of the first times this actually happened. So this is quite ingenious, quite a new thing. So this is a change from what thriller films were before this. But apart from that, a lot of the same really. I mean, the music, the same, in great suspense, like action scenes. The music was building up, but dialogue, there was a lot of silent music, just a bit of diegetic, maybe radio in the background or sounds. So yeah, apart from that, that is our second film, and we're going to be going on to our third film right about now. Our third film is from 1975 and directed by Steven Spielberg, and it is Jaws. So, the quick basic plot synopsis of this film is: when a gigantic great white shark begins to cause menace to a small island community of Amity, a police chief and marine scientists and fishermen are set out to stop it. Very basic plotline, but still doesn't make it any less of a great film. So, this first start off the setting of this film. Firstly, it's on a beach, which is, like most of it, is sort of the beach to seaside, which is quite usually a happy thing you would connote with, like, a happy comedy or romantic film, not a scary, murdering thriller film. So, this instantly is like juxtaposition to what you would expect to be in these films, and that goes against already what we saw in the 50s and 60s as conventions of thrillers. Also, a lot of it's set at sea, so again, it's quite confined spaces. So, again, it's carrying over the confined space idea, which we had in the previous thrillers we've looked at, but to a new level, obviously, in the sea, out of depth, adding to fear. So this sort of more is a thriller slash horror, you could say. A psychological thriller is a correct term for it. Then, the characters in this film, well, the protagonists are Quint, a shark hunter. That's a new one. Basically, he's technically, you could say, a killer, but this time he's the protagonist. So kind of like an anti-hero, if you care about great white sharks being alive. And then obviously, quite Hendricks, and then Brody. One's a deputy, one's a police chief. That's like, same as we see in everyone. Deputy, police chief. Also, there's a police station once or twice in the film for setting, so typical what you would expect. And then, obviously, in Jaws, the music. So, obviously, the non-diegetic music only used for suspense. We all know what scene that's from. When the shark comes and it ends up eating the child, and then everyone comes running out of the sea. Basically, that is obviously great use of music, and that's stayed the same throughout the past 3 decades of thriller films, what we have looked at. Basically, the music, there's a non-diegetic music when there needs to be suspense, and there's no need for music when there's no need to be suspense. It's silent, which silence in itself adds to the suspense. So anyway, let's move on to our fourth film from the 80s. And the fourth film we're going to be looking at is from 1980, directed by Stanley Kubrick, a great director, and it is The Shining. Now, some people could say this is a horror, and could argue for that, but I believe, by looking at the definition I gave for a thriller, I class this as a psychological thriller. Obviously, it's based on a Stephen King novel, so they're always going to be scary, but anyway. So let's quickly go in with the plot synopsis I've written down. A family heads to an isolated hotel for the winter, where an evil and spiritual presence influences the father into violence when his psychic son sees horrific forebodings from the past and the future. Basically, his son's psychic and can see the future and the past and see stuff which happens, and the dad goes crazy. Yeah, essentially, that's it. So the setting for this film, well, they're up in a hotel, so that is different. Like, we're not confined online, we're not in apartments, and there's no police station, even though the wife just tried to call the police. And it sort of goes through to an operator, but there isn't any actual police people or police station, but it still is that sense of like protection from the character Dick, who ends up coming back to try and save the boy Danny and Wendy, but that doesn't work out. Let's just leave it at that. But yeah, it's still confined because they're just in the hotel, and the setting ends up getting quite extravagant due to the hallucinations from Jack in the film. So obviously, as I've been saying, the two main protagonists, Wendy, the wife, Danny, the son, main protagonist, I would say, the psychic. And then Dick's a protagonist who comes back to try help, who's also another psychic. And then the antagonist in this is Jack. He starts off as the protagonist, but as he gets more and more mentally insane, he ends up becoming the antagonist and trying to kill his family. So the music, where we start there is the iconic music as when they're driving up to it, and then apart from that, music same as it has been in the previous years. Not used often, but when it is used, it is obviously used to create the suspense and rise the suspense, anticipation, keep you on the edge of your seat. So yeah, this is, apart from it being a horror, this is generally pretty similar. Nothing's really changed from the 70s to the 80s between these thriller films. So let's go on to our fifth film from the 90s. The fifth film in our timeline is coming to us from 1995, so they're bang in the 90s. Yay! Anyway, it is Seven, directed by David Fincher. And if you haven't seen this film, I recommend seeing it. It's awesome. And the plot for this one is basically two detectives, a rookie and a veteran, hunt a serial killer who uses the 7 deadly sins as his motive to kill. So, start off with the setting. Well, obviously, as you heard already, detectives. Back to the conventions, the norms. And the setting isn't much different. A lot of eerie death scenes, but also a lot of time in the prison, in the police station, in the detective office. So, sticking to those raw conventions of the thrillers, which I've acknowledged so far. And then the characters, well, the two protagonists are detectives. Somerset, who's Morgan Freeman's character. Mills, who is Brad Pitt's character. Detectives, pretty much. And then the antagonist, once again, takes you back to what I said in the 50s for a Rear Window. It's John Doe. He's an ordinary man, but has committed a crime, which is a murder, which makes him crazy. An antagonist. Not much more to say than that, really. Obviously, the music, same as always, like, quite quiet when intense dialogue's happening, but when there's suspense and anticipation and action, for example, the shooting scene when they come to John Doe's apartment and the chase, intense music in the background there to complement the action on screen to make the audience feel on the edge of their seats, and also the build-up of music at the very end to, edge of your seat, what's going to happen next. And personally, I think for our project, I'll take some inspiration from this film, especially with the suspense of the music at the very end, with the intenseness, and obviously the quick camera cuts at the end to show a sense of panic. I think in our film we're going to take inspiration from this and have probably used something like this. Now going on to our film from the noughties, the 2000s as you want to call them. So 2 more films left. The 6th film in our timeline comes to us straight from the year 2000, and it is the film of Memento. Now again, a cracking film, directed by Christopher Nolan. Anyway, the quick plot. A man creates a strange system to help him remember things, so he can hunt for the murderer of his wife without his short-term memory loss being an obstacle. So this is a pretty in-depth thriller, not what you expect, quite hard to follow. No, one of those you have to watch it twice to fully understand it sort of ones. So a bit like the 90s, plot twists have become quite a common thing in these thrillers. So anyway, the general setting in this film is set loads where, it is confined in these motels, but it's also set all around town. The tattoo parlour, bar, abandoned places, abandoned sort of parts outside of town. Set in a lot of places. Now, the characters for this well, you got the main protagonist, Leonard, the dude without his memory, and like, he may not actually be a policeman or a detective, but he's the way he's hunting down his wife's killer. He's like a detective. So again, living with the conventions, another police/detective sort of thing. And then you have Teddy, the antagonist, who is a murderer. Yeah, simple enough, a murderer. Then another protagonist you got, but it's always a secondary protagonist, which is common within all these films. There was even one in 7. I just forgot to mention it. Natalie. It's just a woman who's there. Like, yes, they have point, but they're never the main protagonist in these films. They're always secondary in thrillers, it seems. So that's a convention. And something in this one I've noticed was setting, which also happened in the 90s in 7, I just forgot to mention it, is they're sort of like, instead of it being quite, it's still confined, but instead of being really confined, it's a more broader sort of setting. They go a lot more places. There's a lot more space to roam, I guess you could say. But speaking of inspiration, the place they go to in this film, the abandoned place, I like that idea for our own film because I feel like an abandoned place really sort of sets the tone of a thriller, makes it sort of underlining, scary, you could say, you know. And you can actually think something's going down here, something illegal's going down here. So I want to use somewhere abandoned for our eventual opening to our film, because I feel like it's a really good thriller convention and it works really, really well. And our final film for our brief thriller timeline, brief inverted commas, this is quite long actually, but anyway, it's The Ghost Writer from 2010 by Roman Polanski. So the basic plot of this is a ghostwriter is hired to complete the memoirs of a former British Prime Minister, but he uncovers secrets that put his own life in jeopardy. So this is back to the 60s in a Mercurian calendar, a political political thriller, sorry. So yeah, but it also has obviously aspects of crime as per usual, even though like one of the main figures isn't a detective for once. There is a scene in a police station and to be fair, even when there isn't a detective, our main character, the Ghost, that's all he is, he's just referred to as the Ghost, he doesn't actually have a character name, who is the ghostwriter. He does his own detective work to try to discover whether our antagonist, Adam Lang, the ex-Prime Minister, is a bad guy, what he's done wrong, blah 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 blah, all that stuff. So that's the characters of the film. The music in this one, so that's pretty much the same. So from the 1950s all the way up to modern day, they keep the music the same in the thriller. Very minimalist, not minimalistic, but very minimal use, unless in high tension scenes. So that is pretty similar. They've kept the conventions with sort of a crime, that's very similar as well, and they've sort of kept it now for detectives, blah blah blah. So pretty much all the conventions are pretty much the same, apart from, in this one again, as I said about Memento and 7, the setting, instead of being so confined, it's quite a broader area. You still feel confined in the fact that he's not allowed to leave with the memoirs and stuff in the film. He's not allowed to leave the house, but there's a lot more setting use. It's not just like one apartment like it was in Rear Window, or a couple apartments in Mercurian Candidate, you know. It's very broad, a lot of stuff. So this film, you could say, goes against the conventions with the former setting and characters, but they also do conform to the settings in the conventions in the same way. So yeah, that's the end of this timeline. Brief note on the Ghostwriter. I feel like that we could also again take inspiration for this for the start of our film. The fact that it's quite, what's the word, ambiguous. You're not quite sure what's going on at the start of this film when it happens with all the cameras and angles and stuff. I like the idea of that as well, so maybe we could use some ambiguity in our own piece, but I'm not sure about that. That's really up to interpretation. I'm not quite sure how we're going to do that, but that's just a bit of, inspiration I thought about this. So this has been Daniel from JK Pictures. This is a brief timeline of thriller films from the 1950s all the way up to the modern days. Hopefully this is good.